task tonight is an easy one, for I am to introduce somebody who really needs no introduction here at the Telfair. Koons McCullough is the former Director of Collections and Exhibitions here at the museum, and she was employed here from 1996 until 2011, beginning her work in the museum's education department before taking over control of the curatorial department. In that capacity in the curatorial department, Holly spearheaded many major projects, too numerous to list here, but to name just a few, she organized the publication of the first catalog of the museum's collections. She was the organizing curator of the Telfair's first internationally traveling exhibition, one we all remember fondly, Dutch Utopia, American Artists in Holland from 1880 to 1914. Holly also curated a diverse number of contemporary exhibitions on a variety of themes, including one of the more notable ones was an exhibition of the work of Anthony Goicolea entitled Alter Ego. Holly relocated to the Washington, D.C. area in 2011, and we still miss her every day, where she is currently employed as an independent curator and curator of exhibitions for the Greater Reston Arts Center in Reston, Virginia, as well as curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown, Maryland. Holly holds a BA in English from the University of Notre Dame and an MA in Art History, a BA in English and Art History from the University of Georgia, of course, and the MA in Art History from Notre Dame. Personally, Holly hired me here at the Telfair almost 8 years ago, and over the course of our 6 years working together was a mentor, a friend, and an inspiration every day. And still the work I do today, I do thinking of the standards that you set, and I try to live up to those every day. So. Personally, I'm delighted to have her back, and she's here tonight in conjunction with the exhibition that Lisa mentioned, Spanish Sojourns, Robert Henri and the Spirit of Spain. Holly was the organizing curator of this exhibition originally here at the Telfair, and it was her passion and her perseverance that got the institution to support the show and to tackle this very ambitious project that took many years to put together. Holly contributed an essay to the catalog examining the dramatic and distinct ethnic and cultural types in Robert Henri's Spanish paintings, and this will be the subject of her lecture tonight. So I hope you will all join me in very warmly welcoming Holly McCullough.
You might not want to do that yet. Thank you for the warm welcome. I don't even have words for how wonderful it is to be back here and see so many friendly faces. I have missed you all. I have missed the Telfair. I've missed my former colleagues, and I'm really delighted to be back. I want to start by thanking Harry and Glenna from the Education Department for inviting me to speak here tonight. I was delighted to hop on the plane and have a chance to come back to Savannah. And to Lisa for allowing that as well, and to Courtney for keeping me involved in this project, which was very dear to my heart before I departed the Telfair, and also to Courtney and Jessica and the curatorial crew for what I thought was an outstanding installation of the paintings upstairs. It blew me away when I walked in the door, and I hope you all felt the same about it. I think they did an incredible job. I'm glad you did it. I'm not sure that I could have done something to that standard. Absolutely excellent. So after all this hype, I'm really not sure I can live up to this, guys. This is my usual off-the-cuff, sort of fun approach to looking at Robert Henri's Spanish types. And as Courtney mentioned and Lisa mentioned, I wrote an essay for the catalog that details this in a far more articulate manner than I am likely to deliver tonight. It was a really interesting subject for me because I noticed that Henri really was gravitated particularly to portrayals of gypsies, but also, of course, to dancers and bullfighters. And these ethnic types, if you will, really made up the bulk of his Spanish images, and kind of defined for him an approach that he would utilize in going to other countries, to define those kinds of essential types that reflected upon the traditions and the nature of the countries that he was visiting. So to jump in here, this is a portrait of Henri in 1897. This is slightly before he made his first trip to Spain in 1900. And then a photograph, okay, I admit I just got it off Google. I just really liked it, but I think it's early 20th century of some Spanish gypsies. And they actually had there are any number of historical postcards from the early 20th century of gypsies. They were sort of exotic thing if you were an American or European from particularly Northern European country. This would be something about Spain that would interest you, and you might go home with a little souvenir of gypsy culture like the image that you see here. Robert Henri said, he said a lot of things about gypsies actually, but my favorite thing that he said about gypsies was, "I always feel when I'm in the presence of a gypsy, however uncouth he may be, that I am in the presence of an aristocrat." And this very much defines what I see as a kind of embedded, conflicted attitude in Henri's approach to portraying gypsies, and for that matter, other ethnic types. He was susceptible to American stereotypes about these different cultures, and they did reflect in his work, but for the most part, he had a far broader view than other artists of his age. So as we get into the talk, I'm going to compare some other portrayals of gypsies. Before we get there, I just want to sort of set the stage. During the late 19th century, particularly the 1890s and into the first decade or so of the 20th century, as Henri began to visit Spain very regularly, there was a rise of interest, national interest in Spanish culture. This happened to be at a time when the Americans had defeated the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. The Spanish were no longer a real threat politically. It was seen as a country in decline militarily and politically, but culturally, possibly because it was no longer a threat, Spain became very interesting to Americans and other Europeans alike. And part of it was that it was a slow country to industrialize. It retained a lot of traditions that were seen as authentic and essential and uncorrupted by industrialization and civilization. And so monuments to Spanish culture arose on American soil. So what you're looking at, probably many of you have visited this incredible space, the Spanish cloister at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which was built in 1914 to accommodate the amazing icon John Singer Sargent's El Jaleo that we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So Spain had become an object of fascination for artists, partly because of the exotic cultural types that they expected to find there. And so you're looking at two Henri images, one of a Segovian girl, a girl in traditional costume, festival costume, and another, the Gibbs's highly envied painting, envied by me anyway. Henri's the green fan of a lovely, this is actually the same girl. And by the way, I'll talk a lot about Henri's desire to be authentic and to represent a unique individual, but occasionally he did flub things. So you will see this same girl in the gallery, and Courtney nicely grouped them together. At one point she's called Girl from Toledo, and in the other images she is from Seville. And so occasionally he sort of switched things around and took a little artistic license, and it's worth remembering that. When Elizabeth Boone comes, I'm sure that she will talk more about the basis of her essay, which is the dialectical view of Spain amongst Americans and Northern Europeans. And that involved one view in which Spain was seen as a sunny, balmy, relaxed, pleasant place to be. You're looking at William Merritt Chase's Sunny Spain from 1882, which kind of reflects this view. A place that's uncorrupted by the evils of industrialization, that is very authentic and real. And on the other hand, there's the Spain that is darker and moodier and passionate to the point of distraction and quite possibly decadent. And Elizabeth Boone will probably talk about La Leyenda Negra. It's a sort of, it's how Spain got a bad rap from one of its own, starting in the 16th century. It was a kind of legend about Spain's war atrocities and what we would call today civil rights violations that gave the country a reputation for intemperance, intolerance, darkness, and even worse, sort of laziness and violence. So there were two ways to look at the country. Henri, I think, saw both sides pretty evenly, but was very interested in the dark side. And it's interesting to me that this landscape, and you will see this beautiful landscape upstairs, this landscape is not of the sunny Spain variety. It is extremely moody with these dark rolling clouds floating in, settling in over the church and the village. It's beautiful, but it has a kind of moody, ominous quality to it. Henri also sought out subjects that were full of pathos in Spain, and so you will also see upstairs the almost painful to look at blind Spanish singer that when he created, he knew this was not a marketable subject. But in fact, Henri early on in his career decided that he was not going to be a traditional portrait artist. A traditional portrait artist makes a living by painting people who are wealthy enough to pay for that painting, and who generally then want to be portrayed nicely, if not outright flattered. Henri realized he couldn't do that. That was not his interest in painting people. He was about capturing individual spirits. And so he decided to capture things even if they were painful. And he talks about in his diaries and his journals listening to this woman sing and this sort of mournful singing, and then the painful silences when she stopped singing during the modeling sessions, but could not see where she was, and how terrible that was for him. So he experienced a lot, I think, of feelings of sympathy and compassion for the less fortunate people he encountered in Spain. I threw in that other photograph because it was remarkable to me. She's not a blind girl as far as I can see, but look at the pose. Look at how incredibly similar that female figure looks with the guitar. And time again, in looking back at old photographs and postcards, I found characters who very strongly resembled the people who are depicted in Henri's paintings, again lending to that idea of authenticity. You knew I had to go back to Dutch Utopia, so I'm just going to get it over with at the beginning. The other thing that really struck me in looking at Henri's works was that Spain had a very different calling card for artists who came there. It represented a different ethnic type of interest than the peasants of the Netherlands or of Breton anywhere in France. We knew with Dutch Utopia that artists like Gary Melchers and his circle sought out remote areas of Holland to find people who wore traditional dress and lived in a traditional way and were uncorrupted by industry and commercial growth. And he managed to do that. But the characterization of the Dutch is so strikingly different from what you see artists doing when they get to Spain. And so here is our fantastic painting in the Telfair's collection, the Melchers Vespers, of this wonderful young woman in church, one of many church paintings that Gary Melchers did. If you look at the body of Gary Melchers' work, you think that the Dutch just sat around in church, 12 hours a day. Whereas on the other hand, you will see plenty of tavern scenes in Spain. I don't know how many of you remember when Dutch Utopia was here, Melchers' wonderful piece called The Pilots, which showed a lot of sailors sitting around in a tavern. Everything was there but the drinks. There was no drinking going on. Well, that doesn't happen in Spanish images. I'm sorry this is in black and white. This is a fantastic painting at the Metropolitan by William Turner Dannett that for some reason they have never managed to shoot in color. And you can see this smoky bar. Dannett was an American artist who had an interest in Spanish subjects. You have, males and females in close proximity in ways that probably wouldn't have happened in that time amongst certain European cultures and American culture. And you have, sort of this sense of rowdiness and maybe lasciviousness going on. A complete polar opposite from the uncorrupted Dutch. And just because I couldn't help myself, you have the prim and pious goat herd versus Henri's El Tango. I'm really sorry not to be around for the sizzling salsa dance thing, by the way. I would really like to do that. And I did want to point out that one of Henri's primary draws in Spain, outside of the people, the culture itself, was Diego Velázquez. Velázquez was probably more than any other artist Robert Henri's hero. He spent countless hours at the Prado, studying, and in some cases earlier in his career, copying the paintings. Many times when he went to Spain, he was actually bringing summer classes there. He had his students copy Velázquez paintings at the Prado. Velázquez's techniques and his approach to humanity, and I'll just give you one quote. Henri said Velázquez was a man in love with humanity. That is, he was very democratic. He portrayed everyone from the sort of lowliest street urchin to the king, and Henri loved that democratic range and tried to emulate it in his own work. So to sort of close on where I'm going here with the perception of Spain, a scholar that I looked into, a sociologist, quite a bit when I was writing the essay, said, long after Romanticism had languished as a dominant literary movement, scores of British and American travelers daily reinvented Spain as a permanently romantic locale, a place untouched by the savagery of modern industry and progress, where with a bit of luck and determination, one could participate in the intoxicating life of wine, women, and song. All right, Gitanos. This is the Spanish term for gypsy, and I am just going to point out right away that many people today consider this term offensive and derogatory, and I do apologize if you are included in that number. However, that is the term that Henri used, and so I decided to stick with that in my essay and in my lecture. Henri is seeking out these old world Spanish traditions, but he does it first in his own studio. So in 1905, he hired a model who was known as Zenka of Bohemia to pose in his studio, and this was one of the first gypsified portraits that Henri would do. At this point, he's only made one trip to Spain. He will go back the next year in 1906. But he did come back with some props, a couple of shawls, things that he could put on models to make them look Spanish. And in the case of Eugenie Stein portrait, he described the dress as being gypsy dress, as having an effect that should look like a gypsy in Spain. And so you begin to see him play here with this concept. Previous to this, he did a couple of staged Spanish dancers, which had gotten a lot of good critical reviews, and so he decided to keep going in this direction. I'll point out right away, many of you are familiar with grand manner portraiture. If you think of sort of large-scale sergeant paintings of wealthy, distinguished individuals, that's grand manner portraiture. It's exactly what it sounds like. The people in those portraits look incredibly grand. They're usually very important. Henri co-opted that tradition entirely, and instead of the distinguished people, he puts in gypsies, even if they're staged gypsies, or scandalous dancers, or sometimes street urchins. It's one of the most compelling features of his art. La Trinidad, Gypsy of Madrid, is the first sort of authentic gypsy portrait that he would do. He was eating, in his trip to 1906 trip to Spain, he was having his meal outdoors when a troop of gypsies came by, and he asked this particular woman if she might be interested in posing for him, and as you can see, she was. What I love about this portrait is it sets up something that you will see time and again in these portraits, which is this sense of pride, this sense of self-assuredness. There's almost always an arm akimbo pose. You know that she is a gypsy partly by her hairstyle, the accoutrements, the flowers, the scarf, the shawl. There's a certain manner of dress that if Henri couldn't get it on his model, he would actually occasionally supply props that would convey the effect. Courtney pointed this out to me, and I just want to note it. It's really fascinating. In most cases, Henri's backgrounds are more or less blank. They allow the figure to shine. They refer back to Velázquez and also to Manet by way of Velázquez. In this portrait, you have this interesting. It's a wall with the wainscoting there, and it's almost Whistlerian in its feel, and it's very unusual, and it doesn't appear again in any of the other portraits, but it makes this particular sitter look much more grounded. Now, I want to go back a little ways and look at some historical depictions of gypsies and how they were depicted in Western art prior to Henri taking up the subject. And so you can see here Caravaggio's Fortune Teller from 1594, excuse me. This is a very early portrayal of the gypsy theme, and many of you have probably seen this painting, at least reproduced. You see she's reading his palm. She is also removing his ring. And this gets at the heart of one of the concepts, the widespread concepts, stereotypes about gypsies during this period. that had been around for hundreds of years, and that is that they were thieves. They were not to be trusted. They were dishonest people. You see that time and again in representations of them. Franz Hals was much more generous. This gypsy just forgot all her undergarments and is just particularly friendly. So this is a wonderful image though, because as you know, Henri also went to Holland and did Dutch portraits, and he was very interested in Dutch culture as well, and fascinated by Franz Hals. And Hals's brushwork, his bravado brushstrokes, were a key influence on his work. So a wonderful reference back to Hals, who was important to Henri. But you can see here, this is a sort of, I don't think it's an entirely negative portrayal, but this is a woman who is forthright, who is sensual, who is enjoying herself. This is a sort of, I'm sorry, it's a really bad genre painting, but I was struck by the content by a Russian artist, mid-19th century. This is the kind of thing when you read accounts of gypsies that you would sort of envision in your mind. Many of them were street dwellers. They sort of had their family encampments, if not in the streets, then on the edge of town. Their children were often dirty, and as you can see here, naked sometimes as well. But they were also musicians and dancers, and so you have one of the gypsies, the gentleman in the background, while having his cigarette. That's another thing. Apparently, gypsy men had to have cigarettes permanently affixed to their lips, because there are almost no portraits of them without it. He's smoking his cigarette and strumming his guitar, and then presumably his son is dancing in the background. And all of these elements are very much reflected in sort of accounts and stereotypes of gypsy life. The gypsies did not have an easy life in Spain, and I should say that the term gypsy comes from the idea, the thought early on, that this particular ethnic group of people had come out of Egypt because their skin was dark. And in fact, the gypsies, the Romani people as they're properly known, are traced back to northern India, and they moved slowly into Eastern Europe and then to points west, landing in Spain in the mid-15th century. So their presence there goes back many, many centuries. And ultimately, despite attempts to expel them, and here you can see a British artist's genre portrayal or history portrayal of the supplicants, gypsies coming to the Pope to try and allow themselves to stay, but there have been several edicts to force them out. That never happened. And in fact, their culture has become inseparable with Spanish culture as a whole. Flamenco would not exist. It's been fairly proven now. Without the gypsy influence, it was generated through that cultural mix of gypsy and Andalusian Spaniard. So they suffered a lot over the history of marginalization. And then by the late 19th century, you see these portrayals of gypsies as kind of romantic, marginalized outsiders, and particularly gypsy women. They were either highly sensualized or they were sort of melancholic innocence. I would say this is a good example of that. And I would also say that Corot, the French artist who created this gypsy picture and many, many other images of gypsies, probably set the tone for how they were portrayed by many other artists in the late 19th century. His gypsies were often in woodland settings. There was an idea that gypsies were, because they were nomadic and often lived on the edge of towns and communities, that they were more in touch with nature, and that they were essentially a naturally moral people. Again, this is part of the dialectic, the other side of which says they're dirty and they're thieves and they steal. Here we go again with the romantic gypsy trope. Gypsies are very often shown. The shawl is pretty ubiquitous, and also with violins or guitars, musical instruments, very, very common. Bohemian was another term that was used often to describe gypsy peoples during this period. American artists began to pick up on the gypsy trope partly through their French teachers in Paris when they were thronging to Paris to study in the mid and late 19th century. Those teachers, like Bouguereau, whom we just saw, were passing on this idea in exotic types. Going back a ways, back to the fortune teller, just so you see how long-lived that trope is, you have Georges de la Tour's 17th century fortune teller, again, where you have one person reading the fortune and the other picking the pocket of the gullible young man. And then on the other side, slightly less insidious, but you have F. Louis Mora, who is sometimes the sort of label that is used for him now as America's first Hispanic artist. And he did, in fact, have family in Spain and travel in Spain during the period Henri was also there. But his Fortune Teller of 1905 portrays a very congenial gypsy girl, hand on hip, smiling out at the viewer with a sort of roguish cohort there, and then an older woman reading the palm in the background. And you just know this guy's going to get robbed before he gets out of there, but it's not quite as obvious. Now, so the overall concept of gypsies, very conflicted concept, is one that was sort of that of a noble savage in some cases, that these people were not completely civilized, but there was a kind of nobility to their lack of civilization. This is a concept that I think Henri really did fall into in many ways. Maria and Consuelo, Gypsy Mother and Child, is a fantastic portrait, actually a series of portraits that Henri did of this mother and child who were possibly sent by Felix Asiego, the bullfighter. We'll get to him later. But he didn't show up for a sitting, and suddenly this gypsy woman and her baby appeared at Henri's door. So obviously Asiego was on to Henri and knew that he would be thrilled with any random gypsy sent to him to paint. So Maria and the baby stayed for quite a long time in the studio. There are 3 portraits of them on view upstairs, and they're all extremely engaging. She has a very fierce stare that is very distinctive. Her features are distinctive. You can tell that you're looking at an actual person and not a type, as in the Bouguereau romantic gypsy image. She is very specific. She's wearing the ivory combs that Henri described as being typical, a flat black braid in the back of her hair. All of these identified her as a gypsy. And I'm going to read you a little bit about what Henri had to say about Maria and her baby. I got one of my gypsy Gitano friends to pose, a Gitano woman with her brilliant colors, dark skin, enormous black eyes, jet black and abundant hair slicked with the paste they all put on their hair here. White ivory combs in the hair, flowers and a yellow shawl, her baby in red in her arms. She is only 18, but these Gitanos all have babies, it seems, and their love for them seems to be on the verge of fanaticism. They are the most savage people in color, the most childlike people I have ever seen, and as proud as if each one was a king or queen. Always at home, feel that they are your equal, and feel too that you are worthy of them. Have much respect. How many people hear conflict in that description? There's savagery, there's childlikeness, there's fanaticism, there's also pride in a good sense, there is respect. Henri was in a kind of awe of these subjects and how they lived. He talked about the fact that Maria lived on the street with her husband, who was a musician, a guitar player. We'll meet him in a little bit. And he wrote to his mother, "They are dirty, and the babies are like young animals, and not the clean kind either. The mothers seem to have the mother instinct to an intensity. Children themselves, they seem, and with all their irregularity of life, there is from appearances a natural morality. This girl with her baby seemed to have the most perfect spirit of happiness and contentment." So again, this dual-sided image, it's almost, after I read enough of these comments, I felt like the gypsies, portrayals of gypsies really embodied those 2 concepts of Spain itself, sunny Spain versus La Leyenda Negra in one compact package. This full-length portrait is again a great subversion of the Grand Manner portrait tradition. And then you see this one incredibly beautiful, this I think is the most direct and compelling portrait in my view, where the baby also looks out, and Maria is on the verge of a smile. She doesn't quite get there, but there is this sense that she might be warming up to you. I looked around for other images of gypsy women with their babies, the sort of Madonna and Child model, if you will. And I found very few. I found lots of images of groups of gypsies with lots of rowdy children, but not this sort of singular portrayal of a mother and child, which of course is a hallmark of much of Western art. And so I looked around for something that might compare and found William Merritt Chase's first portrait of many, many years earlier. Very likely that Henri knew this portrait because he and Chase had worked together at the New York School of Art, which Chase had founded, before they had a very public breaking. They were quite adversarial with each other, but I thought what an amazing sort of pendant and contrast. You have Chase's very elegant, Asian-inspired, very dignified portrayal of his wife, Alice, and his newborn baby. And then you have Henri's more direct, slightly, there's a sense of, again, fearsomeness and protectiveness that Maria has for her baby, but I still think all the grandeur and dignity that you find in the Chase portrayal. This is Maria's husband. Henri did not have the kindest things to say about him. He called him the usual cheap article, felt that he was basically a kind of rogue, but you see this wonderful picture of him, his name was Ramon, posing in Henri's studio, and then what Henri does with that. I think it's very close to the mark, isn't it? It's very authentic. These photographs were Henri's, and they're wonderful. They're also on display in the exhibition upstairs, and they're just great little bits of history linking Henri's actuality with the paintings on the wall. You can see that Ramon is, again, given a kind of roguish smile. He has a sense of being up to no good, but also of being very joyful and vital. Henri was surely aware of Edouard Manet's Spanish singer from 1860. There is a type of the male Spanish guitarist that existed out there, and this is probably the most impressive example of that. This was also a staged portrait done in Manet's studio, so this model was given Spanish props and told to look like a singing gypsy. Did it pretty well. But it gives you also a sense of that gypsy trope extending back to the mid-19th century. And Manet, of course, was an artist who greatly admired Spanish culture and did a number of Spanish subjects and was therefore an influence upon Henri. Another interesting comparison, this is a bust-length portrait of Ramon that Henri completed. Ramon with his cigarette, I promised you that. And a Chase portrait of a gypsy with a cigarette. These are very close in terms of their date. It is very possible that Henri saw Chase's and decided to sort of riff on that. I don't have any evidence for that. If it doesn't represent Henri besting Chase, then what it does represent is a remarkable consistency in the portrayal of young gypsy men as kind of roguish, scheming characters. And the mere fact that the Chase painting is called a gypsy swell, a swell or a dandy, as Henri referred in his journals to Ramon. This idea of someone who is kind of put on, shallow, up to no good, but lots of fun anyway, and full of a lot of pride. Very much comes out in these portraits. Henri then turns his attention to children. This is actually a portrait that will invest him with a lifelong interest in portraying children that will only grow towards the end of his career. In Spain, his subjects, for whatever reason, were more adult, but he did do this fantastic portrait of a little girl named Emilia, which he subtitled Cinco Centimo, which was a very small Spanish coin, so it referred to this child's lack of wealth. Again, this is sort of Henri's idea of plucking a street urchin off the streets. It's where you get a street urchin, I guess, and putting them on a canvas, giving them a kind of aesthetic weight that most people would have found inconceivable at this time. There is such immediacy to this portrait. It is incredible if you haven't seen it in person. And it very much reflects Henri's interest in Franz Hals and Hals's smiling children. This is something that he's trying to replicate here. Madre Gitana from 1912. I'm very struck by this portrait, which is reproduces nicely, but is even more fantastic in person, by the sense of seriousness and dignity in this woman's face. She doesn't look fierce. She looks extremely intelligent to me. She is down to business. She is not going to be made fun of, and he is taking her seriously. And this is all the more interesting because this is not typical of portrayals of single female gypsies. You see another here, very serious and sweet young girl. In this case, the gypsy girl Barbina. If he did not title this The Gypsy Girl, you would have no idea that this was a gypsy. And that is one of Henri's interesting dualities, that sometimes he would enhance the ethnic quality of a subject, just sometimes, and other times you would never know you were looking at an ethnic subject unless he told you in the title. And so that speaks to his sense of capturing individualism, of capturing an actual person and trying to let them show through as opposed to a stereotype. And he's done that very well here. This is another wonderful example, Wild Gypsy, where you see that same model. This one I think is remarkable just on a technical level for the way the paint just almost disintegrates at the bottom of that canvas. It's like a wonderful tornado of paint swirling around, so you really just focus on the sort of concreteness of her face. Again, very serious, very dignified. Well, this is how, gypsies were more typically portrayed. This isn't even a gypsy, in fact, it's just someone pretending to be a gypsy. This is Renoir's mistress at the time, Lise Trejo, and you see her in this picture with the off-the-sleeve, sort of sheer blouse, hair down in dishabille, a kind of bohemian look to her, a very sensual portrait. Again, a woman would not appear in public in this way. This is by nature an intimate portrait during this period. And appending the name Gypsy to a portrait of a sensual portrait sort of allowed that subject to be displayed. It was rather like having a nude woman and calling it a Greek goddess. You could get away with that. Ethnic types, people who were not straightforward Western women who should be behaving better, you were allowed to invest them with a kind of sensuality, and so it allowed artists to kind of go around the moral rules. Manet didn't have a whole lot of regard for that, though. This is a wonderful portrait. Who wants to buy a horse from this lady? Isn't she incredible? Gypsy with cigarette, of course. The gypsies were also known as horse traders, the sort of car dealers of their age. And you can see her, again, she smokes, she has a very, very kind of aggressive devil-may-care stance, and this hand on the hip stance, this sense of pride, of almost arrogance, is something that will mark portrayals of gypsies over and over and over again. But the lack of femininity in this figure would have been absolutely confrontational. So the gypsies were either romanticized as enormously sensual creatures, or you get the other end, the don't mess with me horse salesperson. Another wonderful portrait that I found of a gypsy, I just, again, am struck, look at the shawl, look at the hairstyle, I'm struck by how often she seems to basically reappear in Henri's portraits, and then Henri's wonderful Lorena Mora, we'll revisit her in a moment. But you can see that hand on the hip stance, and that's something that distinguishes both the gypsy portraits and also the Spanish dancers, and suggests a kind of forwardness that Henri did not associate with most women. The Spanish gypsy from 1912 was destined to become the first ashcan school painting collected by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So by the time Henri completes his 1912 visit in Spain, his gypsy subjects are of great interest. He is selling them, he is showing them widely. The Metropolitan acquires this work, I think a couple of years after it was made. I have to tell you that this reproduction is terrible. The work does not photograph well, and when you see this in person, it is a completely different painting. Today was the first day I've seen this painting in person, and I've often thought, wow, the Met just did not have their game on when they chose this particular Henri for their collection. But in fact, it is subtle and it is full of the kind of spirit that really defines Henri's paintings of gypsies. You have this woman, this incredible bone structure staring out at you unapologetically, unabashedly, and yet there's nothing particularly sensual about her. And the fact that he tells you she's a madre too, she is a matron, a woman of some stature, she is respectable in her community, and he gives her a kind of sense of dignity and importance. Strangely, this is the same model. Yeah, that's what I said, because I don't know, maybe he took 20 years off her, and this looks like a girl to me. When you look at the bone structure though, it's actually the same model. So here you see Henri taking a little bit of artistic license again. And one last extremely colorful portrait of the gypsy Dolores, where again you see this very dignified portrayal. You would not be surprised to see a high-class, New Yorker presented in this same seated, dignified manner. So Henri is moving away from those stereotypes by which most artists portray gypsies. Moving into dancers. He initially began doing a series of Spanish dancers by staging models in his studio. This is a shawl that he very likely brought back from his first visit to Spain, draped over this model in New York. Her name was Mariana Bustamante. She had that sort of dark Spanish look, and voila, he has a Spanish dancer. Spanish dance was becoming extremely popular during this period, still considered a little bit controversial. In the 1890s, it was considered downright lascivious and indecent by many people, but over the course of that decade, it picked up steam. Part of the reason was probably the popularity of Bizet's opera Carmen, which had become wildly popular at the end of the 19th century. That was a gypsy subject, but also there was a strong interest there in dance. And so these Spanish performers became more and more sought after, and people were more and more interested in Spanish dance. This is another staged portrait of Mariana Bustamante, done early on in Henri's New York studio. And then this last one, also staged, Spanish dancer The Cigarette. He described in his journals the fact that he had turned her into a gypsy. He gives her now the cocky bolero hat, puts a few more accoutrements on her and gives her a cigarette, and she is now subversive enough to be a gypsy. Quite different from Mary Cassatt's Spanish dancer portrait. This was a work that Cassatt did in the 1870s. In the early 1870s, she made a very important trip to Spain. Was one of the first American artists to really strongly investigate Spanish subjects. And her subjects, though, like most of her work, were appropriate for a woman of her own standing. And so when she portrayed a Spanish dancer, it was not a sensual woman flinging herself around in a smoky tavern. It's a sort of traditionally dressed woman with the mantilla. If I told you this was a Spanish bride, you would not blink an eye. She is that demure and sweet feeling. Of course, Sargent's El Jaleo is a very different thing altogether, and of course all of the artists in Henri's circle were well aware of this monument of American art. This is the perfect blending of sensuality and sort of smoldering passion that defined in many minds the Spanish dance. And I need to say here that Spanish dance is really conflated as well with gypsy culture. So when this piece was first exhibited at Salon in 1882, it was subtitled, and it was called El Jaleo, Dance of the Gypsies. So it was made very clear that this was a gypsy dancing. Flamenco itself is a dance form that arose out of gypsy culture, particularly in Andalusia, and so it's very difficult to separate those traditions from each other, and very often Spanish dancers were also, by definition, gypsies. Not always, but often. I just had to throw her in because she's wonderful, and you can see the freedom of movement that really marked Spanish dance and that made some consider it inappropriate during these early years. And here you have a whole troupe of them again. I have a whole collection of these wonderful Spanish postcards of gypsies playing songs and singing, and it's the Wine, Women, and Song theme. My folder is actually titled Wine, Women, and Song, and I have a lot in there. So, in 1906, Robert Henri meets La Reina Mora. He is very impressed with her. She is a woman who was very famous in Spain at the time as an accomplished Spanish dancer. She had quite a following. Henri was already a dance enthusiast. He was a follower in America of Isadora Duncan and also Louis Saint-Denis. He loved dance, and so he saw her perform. He convinced her to sit for him and actually went over to her apartment and picked the outfit that she was going to wear. And he talked about the fact that he was stunned at her wealth and at her stature when he saw all of the things she had in her apartment. You can see that he gives her this extremely confident pose where with her foot out, her hands on her hip again, And then you can see the reality of Lorena Mora in the postcard that she signed for him. It's signed or inscribed Al Mejor Pintor, to the best painter, Lorena Mora, Madrid, 1906. She didn't look exactly like he portrayed her. I will mention no names, but one of our staff members insists that she was really a drag queen. I don't think that's but it was funny. Another photo, so you can get the sense of this culture. Again, look at the sort of stucco interior, vaulted. It reminds me very much of the background of El Jaleo itself. And then there was this sort of vogue for dressing up proper, non-Spanish women as Spanish dancers. And so you see William Merritt Chase doing that with his wife. Who knows how long she held that tambourine above her head, poor woman. A tambourine player, Mrs. Chase, is a Spanish dancer from 1886. So there was a kind of vogue for portraying dancers that really hit a peak during the visit of Carmencita to America. She was a well-known and, again, somewhat controversial Spanish dancer who came during the 1890s. Sargent was a big fan, as was Chase, and they convinced her to give a performance at Chase's 10th Street studio in New York for a host of insiders, including Isabella Stewart Gardner. So quite a few American luminaries were on hand for that performance. And two very grand portraits resulted from that. So both Chase and Sargent immortalized Carmencita, who, by the way, was not born in Spain and was kind of like, she was a hoax almost, but that's a different lecture. She garnered a lot of praise in her time, and you can see that she's portrayed by Sargent as a sort of queenly figure and by Chase as a kind of vivacious, active, dancing, adored person with roses at her feet. Carmencita inspired music that people could take home and play in the comfort of their own homes. The Carmencita Quick Step, published in 1893. So you can see the kind of fad that it was. Turn of the century, you have painters like Everett Shinn, who was one of Henri's direct circle, considered an Ashcan school member, painting Spanish music hall in 1902. Very devoted to Degas. You can see this is very reminiscent of Degas' Portrait of Dancers. But the idea that there is now a Spanish music hall and proper people can go see it says a lot for the trend that was evolving in America towards appreciating Spanish dance. F. Lutz Mora had another insight. He was, again, of Spanish descent, had relatives in Spain, and was able to sort of go to Spain and portray Spaniards doing Spanish dance in the way that they sometimes actually did. And so this wonderful piece is a family party. This is something he may actually have observed, where dance is occurring within the context of the home, not as part of a public performance, but as part of a lifestyle. And then you get the wonderfully bold El Tango, the model Manolito Marquis that Henri portrayed multiple times, where, again, you take this is where Henri conflates the idea of the gypsy, the sort of slightly subversive, marginalized woman, with the elegant dancer. Kind of puts them together. You have the hand on the hip pose, very assured. This one also less fierce than smiling at you. She has an almost mischievous look about her. One of his signature portraits of this period. And of course, our wonderful La Madre, not this one, but our wonderful La Madrilenita was also a key subject for Henri. He did multiple versions of this young woman, who was the niece of a famous Spanish dancer himself. And, Courtney, I'm forgetting your name, I can't believe it. Thank you, Josefa Cruz. I only worked here for 15 years, so how I could forget Josefa Cruz. So here's Josefa in our portrait, the Telfair's wonderful portrait that really started this whole project. And you can see that she has the same assuredness. She has one hand on her hip, but she's 15 years old. During that season in 1921, he met a Spanish dancer there who was visiting Woodstock for reasons that are not documented, Isolino Maldonado, and he paints her here. And interestingly, he paints her, I think, in a very kind of casual, relaxed way. It's almost a kind of backstage, as if she's done with her performance. She is in a kind of gown that you can imagine her dancing in, but she's done, she's relaxing, she's reflecting on the evening. Very elegant portrait. And then he returns, this is Dorita, a cafe dancer, well known. He returns to this subject again in 1924. I think this is one of the most virtuoso and accomplished portraits in the exhibition. Her skirts are a tour de force of brushwork in and of themselves, and she has that kind of fierce confidence that is associated with so many portrayals of his gypsies and to some extent his dancers. And as I was looking at this today, it suddenly occurred to me that it looks like the Velázquez portrait of Pope Innocent. Does anyone see this? I didn't have time to pull the image, but that is a portrait that Henri knew very well, and I suddenly looked at that throne-like seat and her position and her gaze, and I thought, could he? I don't know. I don't know. Finishing with bullfighters. So let's bring in the bullfighters. The first of the bullfighters that Henri made friends with was a young man named Felix Asiago. He was a 22-year-old former law student, so he was quite educated, intelligent young man. Henri liked him immediately, and they became personal friends. And this is a portrait of Asiago who actually posed in the studio, and there you can see him in a photograph posing in the studio for Henri, and also a photograph of him sort of in his element, where you can see that wonderful kind of squash donut shaped hat. Henri was fascinated, in fact, with the costume, with the lavishness and expense of the costume. He wrote to his mother that he had significant difficulty portraying the left hand because he had been gored by a bull a few weeks earlier and was still wearing a bandage. But he was still going out to fight. He actually posed for Henri shortly before a bullfight, and he confessed to Henri that he did experience some nervousness before getting into the ring until the first charge, and then after that he got his game on. Henri was very interested in capturing this element of psychology, and so you see just a little bit of trepidation in the face of this young man. Oops, sorry. Now, in terms of models that Henri might have been able to look at, we have Francisco de Goya's portrait of the Matador Pedro Romero, which is very much a gentlemanly portrait of this very distinguished-looking matador. And you have Edouard Manet's A Matador from much nearer to Henri's era. Henri would certainly have known this. This is sort of matador with the amazing, what do you call those? Mutton, yes. Aren't they impressive? But typical Manet, he is saluting someone, some dignitary, but you don't know exactly whom. There's this wonderful spare background. It's a full-length presentation. You can definitely see the relationships to Henri's own works. And then you have Mary Cassatt, who approached matadors, but never in the bull ring. And in fact, those portrayals were relatively rare. I'll show you a couple. Cassatt portrayed them in the niceties of daily life before or after a bullfight. And so here you have a flirtatious young woman who is offering the panal, which was a kind of sweet confection, to the bullfighter in a break from the fight. And so basically you have a scene of flirtation going on with lots of wonderful costumes. Now, Henri would certainly have known of Manet's portrayals of bullfights, again, and Manet's Spanish subjects in general, including the famous Dead Toreador, which is not included in this lecture, but everyone knows very well. Many Americans would not go to the bullfights when they visited Spain, feeling that it was an absolutely horrific, violent, uncivilized spectacle. And you're actually seeing in this image by Manet, you're seeing what they most objected to, what Americans most objected to, which was the routine goring of horses, because picadors would ride in on horses and goad the bull into a fury before the matador would come in at the end, and the horses routinely were killed during this part of the spectacle. Henri himself had a different feeling about it. Henri felt that it was an art form, and for all its inhumanity, he wrote to his mother, it still has elements of beauty in it. So he did go to the bullfights, he believed in it and supported it as a cultural expression on the part of Spaniards. F. Lewis Mora was one of the few Americans who attempted to show a bullfighter in action. So you have his Toreador from 1903, obviously influenced by Manet's earlier work. And then you have a wonderful photograph of Henri's, of Felix Asiago, whom we saw earlier, actually in the ring at a bullfight. So again, you get this sense of immediacy that Henri experienced these activities and then portrayed those who engaged in them. He also did picadors. These are the folks I was just talking about, who rode in with a peak or a spike and would goad the bull into a fury. They wore interesting costumes. They wore sort of buttoned buckskin to protect their legs. Henri was fascinated with the costumes, with the cut of the hat, and there's some sort of really interesting ornament up there. I said it looks like a Christmas tree ornament, and I don't know exactly, but like a pine cone with red glitter on it or something. But these are the kinds of elements, these exotic elements that Henri loved to capture in his picture, and I think this very much again reflects back on the Manet model. And then he did a wonderful close-up bust length of this picador. And finally, this is a wonderful little sketch that Henri did of a picador who was called Niño Bonito, pretty boy, because he was apparently incredibly ugly. You don't see that in this wonderful sketch by Henri. Henri did not typically sketch when he was painting. He painted very directly. He had a live model in most cases, and then he painted alla prima directly on the canvas with great gusto and energy to try and capture the energy of that sitter who was in his presence. But he did often sketch from life just for his own edification. This is a wonderful example of that. And I'm going to close with, again, one of my favorite Henri quotes. If any of you have not ever seen it or read it, there's a wonderful collection of Henri's teachings called The Art Spirit, which is full of his amazingly pithy, wonderful quotes about art and also about other artists, and he was just such an inspiring teacher. He is still inspiring to this day. So I'm showing you here a range of the kinds of subjects that Henri approached. Of course, we are focused on the Spanish subjects here, but to the extent that Henri's Spanish subjects portrayed his democratic and more open-minded approach to portraying individuals of different ethnicities, different cultures, he did that in other places as well, and with great regularity. So, to finish with Henri, he said, "I am patriotic only about what I admire, and my devotion to humanity burns up as brightly for Europe as for America. It flares up as swiftly for Mexico if I am painting the peon there. It warms towards the bullfighter of Spain if, in spite of its cruelty, there is that element in his art which I find beautiful. Everywhere I see at times this beautiful expression of the dignity of life, to which I respond with a wish to preserve this beauty of humanity for my friends to enjoy." Thank you very much.